On May 31st, 2014, two 12-year-old girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin, lured their friend into a forest and brutally stabbed her to death in an act of ritual sacrifice, all in an attempt to contact and become proxies of the internet creepypasta sensation known as Slender Man. A staple of internet urban folklore, this idea that pop culture creepypastas like Slender Man or The Rake might have become living, real creatures through some kind of process of focused attention has existed since the early days of internet mass consumption. While the character of Slender Man originated in the imagination of Erik Knudsen in 2009, through the collective belief, intention, and attention of thousands of internet users, there was a growing belief in occult forums that it had taken on a literal existence as a kind of pseudo-spirit or archetype. People were of course quick to invoke the legendary idea of the Tulpa from Tibetan tradition, warning that, quote, "Has anyone thought about the possibility that we're creating a Tulpa? It's a thought form. The one that's realised through the collective efforts of a group of people. We might be creating Slender Man with all of our stories and creepypastas and making him more and more real. After all, the more you think about him, the more he comes after you." That's the general belief among the creepypasta. This isn't the first time that the idea of pop culture spirits or thought forms has entered occult or esoteric discourse, though. Thought forms have been a staple of the Western esoteric tradition since at least the late 19th century, when the Theosophists invoked the Tibetan concept of the Tulpa, claiming that in Tibet, imagined entities can become real, or even turn on their creators. Since then, the idea has flooded into modern chaos magic circles in the form of servitors and egregores, usually established with Jungian archetypes, with discussions of being able to create your own spirits, complete with their own sigils, maybe a fatal flaw embedded if it starts to rebel. But what are the origins of this tradition? And how much of the Western tradition of thought forms actually lines up with anything historical in Tibetan culture, or even the Tibetan conception of a Tulpa? Linguistic and archival evidence instead shows that the encounter between Tibetan Buddhism and Theosophy shifted the meaning of Buddhist terms and concepts. As a result, concepts of emanations that are often found in Mahayana Buddhism were heavily misinterpreted and mistranslated through the lens of theosophical metaphysics. And when we really unpack things, the modern Western thought form is not only misunderstood, but it also has nothing really to do at all with the Tibetan Tulpa. The earliest English mention of the word Tulpa appeared in 1929 in Alexandra David-Neel's book Magic and Mystery in Tibet, in which she recounts a journey studying meditation techniques with monks and defines it as a kind of phantom. She likens the word to another, similar but different Tibetan word, by her estimation, a tulku, which she identifies as a kind of floating form created by magic. But by her own admission, the difference between a tulpa and a tulku is confusing and not very well understood. But she nevertheless claims that a tulpa is created by a magician, whereas a tulku is an emanation of an enlightened being, like a Buddha or a Bodhisattva, and can therefore be much longer lasting. Tulku is itself a Tibetan transliteration of the Sanskrit and Buddhist technical term Nirmanakhaya, which describes the third emanation body of the Buddha. In traditional Mahayana doctrine, formally codified in the 4th century and 3 AD Yogacara treaties, we learn that Buddhas, and sometimes Bodhisattvas, have 3 different bodies or forms: a cosmic truth body, known as the Dharmakaya, an enjoyment body, known as the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya, the emanation body that can manifest into the physical world to help alleviate the suffering of beings. Through techniques that Neel supposedly learnt from monks and native Tibetans while on her travels, she claims in her book that she was able to create a tulpa through prescribed concentration of thought and other mystical rites. She explains that she created a tulpa in the form of a Western monk, rather looking like Friar Tuck, so as not to confuse it with other Buddhist deities or monks. In her description, she vividly explains the process and experience she went through. "I shut myself in a tsams, meditative seclusion, and proceeded to perform the prescribed concentration of thought and other rites. After a few months, the phantom monk was formed. His form grew, gradually fixed and lifelike looking. He became a kind of guest, living in my apartment. I then broke my seclusion and started for a tour with my servants and tents. The monk included himself in my party. Though I live in the open, riding on horseback for miles each day, the illusion persists. I saw the fat tulpa. Now and then, it was not even necessary for me to think of him to make him appear. The phantom performed various actions of the kind that are natural to travellers, and that I had not commanded. For instance, he walked, stopped, and looked around him. The illusion was mostly visual, but sometimes I felt as if a robe was lightly rubbing against me, and once my hand seemed to touch my shoulder. The features which I imagined when building my phantom gradually underwent a change. The fat, chubby-cheeked fellow grew leaner. His face assumed vaguely mocking and sly, malignant look. He became more troublesome and bold. In brief, he escaped my control. Once a herdsman who brought me a present of butter saw the tulpa in my tent and took it for a living llama. I ought to have let the phenomena follow its course, but the presence of that unwanted companion began to prove trying to my nerves. It turned into a day nightmare, so I decided to dissolve the phantom. I succeeded, but only after 6 months of hard struggle. My mind creature was tenacious in its life. Both Tulpas and Tulkus also appear in Evans Wentz's translation of the Tibetan Book of Great Liberation, published in 1954, in which he built on Neel's ideas, claiming that an incarnate deity, like a Dalai or a Tashi Lama, is often called Tulku by Tibetans, and that of a magician is called a Tulpa, meaning a magically produced illusion or creation. Both Neel and Wentz seem to have relied on the same translation efforts and interpretation services of the same man, Qasidara Samdup. Samdup was an important interpreter for the British and an influential translator out of the school in Darjeeling. Although he wasn't a monk, he apparently had an interest in religion and esotericism. Neel even referred to him as almost a mystic at one point. In fact, there's a chance the core groundwork for the Western idea of the Tulpa was laid by Samdup and Wentz a few years earlier in 1927 in their translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. While he doesn't feature the word Tulpa directly, the term thought form and elemental do appear in that translation, where Evans Wentz wrote alongside Samdup. While Neel claims that her idea of the Tulpa was grounded on Tibetan principles, the way she describes it bears far more resemblance in practice to the thought forms and elementals discussed by Annie Besant and Leadbeater in the 20th century. In Tibetan Buddhism, Buddhas and advanced practitioners can create emanations that then act as extensions of their creator. By contrast, the thought forms discussed by Theosophists, Tulpas described by Neel, and pop culture servitors like Slenderman, described by modern occultists, often are created unintentionally or can even turn on their creators. The modern idea of a tulpa or thought form that you hear about in most modern esoteric circles online seems to have originated more with the 19th century Theosophists, and then was disproportionately attributed to Tibetan Buddhism by early 20th century adventurers, largely in an effort to give them a sense of antiquity. It was then rediscovered by modern paranormal lore as a Tibetan concept. One of the first pop culture references to the tulpa is the work of John Keel in his 1975 famous book The Mothman Prophecies. He talks about a supposed haunting in New York in a house formerly owned by Walter Gibson, the author of the popular Shadow series of novels. Apparently, people living in the house complained that they were terrified by a ghost that looked an awful lot like the main character of the Shadow. In his account, Keel invokes the tulpa, saying that, quote, "The Tibetans believe that advanced human minds can manipulate invisible energies into visible forms called tulpas, and create thought projections. Is it possible that Gibson's intense concentration on his novel inadvertently brought the character to life?" Back in 2010, Brad Steiger also seems to have talked about the idea, using Keel as a source in his book The Real Zombies, Living Dead and Creatures of the Apocalypse. Again, saying that, quote, "According to certain Eastern metaphysicians," wonderfully vague, "thoughts, emotions, and mental emanations add to the strength of a tulpa, enabling it to accumulate power and grow. Sometimes, though, even the most accomplished adepts and magicians confess that their tulpa became rebellious." A year before Brad was writing his book, in 2009, the famous Catholic demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, famous for the Conjuring horror movie series, were interviewed about their occult museum, and Ed presented a Halloween mask to the camera, saying that it was used in black magic rituals to, quote, "create a physical manifestation of a tulpa." Outside of these occurrences, ideas about the tulpa have appeared in everything from the TV show Supernatural and The X-Files. Given the prevalence of the books out there in the occult community on including a fatal flaw in your thought form or tulpa, we can also characterize the common understanding of thought forms as creatures or spirits that can be created by anyone, even without thinking about it consciously. They can be created through simple enough attention on them, even by the general public. Thought forms are often considered conscious beings that exist independently of their creator, and are capable of rebellion, are now even dangerous to you or your family if not careful. It's important to say, however, that this idea has absolutely no precedence in Tibetan tradition whatsoever. Tibetan is a difficult language at best of times. It's transliterated into English using something known as the Wiley transliteration system. The word tulpa in this system is transliterated as sprulpa in English, and it is a noun form of the verb sprulba. The root sprul is the same stem that is used in the word sprulsku, which, as we mentioned earlier, is the word tulku in English. I mentioned earlier that tulku is a Tibetan version of the Sanskrit Nirmanakhaya, the third emanation body of the Buddha. Interestingly, the modern Dalai Lama is often referred to as a tulku himself, since he is the reincarnation, i.e. another body, of the previous Dalai Lama. In this way, any enlightened being who reincarnates for the sake of teaching or helping others is referred to as a tulku, since the incarnation is believed to be an emanation of that being's cosmic consciousness or Atman. Tibetanist Jeffrey Hopkins has argued that sprulpa and sprulsku have similar usage in Buddhist literature, so advanced spiritual practitioners can theoretically continually make emanations or manifestations. The Tibetan archivist Nawang Tongki has emphasized, however, that sprulpa were never thought of as arising from thought or belief alone, but rather from the result of a magician's craft, not a corporeal spirit or Buddha. The reason being is that the stem sprul and the noun sprulpa are closely tied in Buddhist literature to the compassionate action of a divine being manifesting in the world. There are 7 instances of the word appearing in the dirge catalogue of Kangur, all of which relate the word to biographies of a Buddhist teacher who is presented as an emanation of the cosmic Buddha. The noun sprulpa appears 84 times in a collection of the Ningamgyam, the esoteric canon of the Ningamgyam school, and it seems to have the same context of being an action or emanation that a powerful being performs in the service of saving others. In some Buddhist texts, sprulpa is even used as a point of comparison to say that something, often the world, is the maya, an illusion, likening it to a magician's trick. This is really the core issue with Evans Wentz and Neel's interpretation of the tulpa. In its original form, in Tibetan, it appears to have been portrayed in 2 ways, as a manifestation or emanation of a divine being, brought about intentionally with love to incarnate or teach, and secondly as a metaphor to liken the world to an emanated illusion. By arguing that a tulpa is a scientific or created concept or being, they divorce it from the soteriological context within Buddhism, and we must recognize that the entire world is a tulpa, an illusionary emanation, and in doing so attain liberation. It seems to have been Neel that came up with the idea that tulpas can be created unintentionally or through collective belief. This cannot be the case in Tibetan. Tibetan makes the distinction between voluntary and involuntary verbs. I broke the glass and the glass broke use different verbs for broke to show the difference of intent and activity. The seminal Tibetan dictionary, the Bodriga Thashid Nadzog Jammo, tells us that the verb sprulba is an active verb, meaning that it is intentional, i.e. someone has to intentionally emanate or manifest something when using it. The ability to do it independently or without thought is impossible. Decades before Wentz and Neel travelled to Tibet, Theosophists were talking about thought forms already in their own context, entirely separate to the idea of the tulpa. Annie Besant describes thought forms as, quote, mental images created and moulded by the mind out of the subtle matter of higher psychic planes. In her seminal work on thought forms, she argued that ideas and thoughts have a kind of ethereal, etheric matter of their own that could be seen or recorded by clairvoyance or pendulums. In theory, at least hers, our thoughts had consequences because they were in fact a subtle matter that was created and dwelled within our aura, influencing it, and as we and our ideas travel through space, they develop a kind of magnetism that attracts similar structured thoughts. Everyone, therefore, creates thought forms all the time, in her estimation, which are effectively clumped together masses of etheric energy or matter produced by our mind, which can then influence our aura or that of another person. In 1865, she seems to have added the idea of ensoulment to her argument, claiming that astral elementals could occupy a thought form and play the part of its soul, and thus effectively create an independent entity or spirit. She claimed that positive elementals were attracted to positive thoughts and negative to negative ones. She also seems to have laid the groundwork for the modern idea of the egregore, claiming that, quote, when a man sends out a thought form, it not only keeps up a magnetic link with him, but is drawn towards other thought forms of a similar type, and these congregating together on the astral plane form a good or evil force, as the case may be, embodied as a kind of collective entity. Westerners have long held notions of exoticism about Vedic and Tibetan culture as part of the Orientalist discourse. Blavatsky herself even located her masters of ancient wisdom in the region. It seems then that the early Theosophists appropriated the term Tulpa from Tibetan culture to give their own ideas an Orientalist precedent. However, we also can't forget the role of Tibetans themselves, and how they played a role in transmitting these ideas to the West. Khasidawa Samdup was a vital part of the term's transmission, and it appears that the contemporary idea of the Tulpa takes its concept from Theosophy and its name from Tibet, but is rather the result of a complex East-West dialogue that resulted in a fusion of theosophical concepts and Tibetan nomenclature, one that may very well have begun with Samdup and Evans Wentz.